Hello AS, welcome to the second instalment of the biological approach flipped learning video. What we're going to look at now is the evaluation point. So this is your A03. Please make sure you've done your A01 as well. You need the whole booklet complete before we move on to psychopathology. So spec, again, supporting evidence, practical applications, evaluation of methods, and contrast to alternatives. And there are a huge number of different ones. The first one we're going to look at is supporting evidence. So by now, hopefully, you feel more confident with structuring those, and I'd like you to work on the point and the explain sentence. If you're feeling particularly brave, what I'd quite like you to do is look at how this research was conducted and then put that as a however point. So, however, and then you can comment on, you consider the research method. Now this is a higher level skill, so I'd highly encourage you to do it, however you don't have to, but it won't be something I'll overtly share on the video, but do have a think about it yourself. Practice those skills, it's all about developing that knowledge. There are two pieces of research supporting evidence that I've given you in a lot of detail here that have come from the book because they're going to be in psychopathology as well, so please do remember them and please use them in psychopathology. You've got Nestrat, who found that people with a first-degree relative with OCD had a 5 times greater risk of having the illness themselves compared to the general population, so people who weren't. So, apologies, someone just came in and spoke to me, so I paused it. However, I'm pretty sure I can remember where I stopped off, just talking about just the first piece of research, Nestrat, and what they found. What I'd want you to do when you were talking about this, the skill I'd want you to practice, is not just memorising the findings, because anybody can memorise them. I would like you to explain to me why this piece of research supports the biological approach. Think about the terminology we've looked at, which bit of terminology links with, and it could be any of them, which bit of terminology links with the idea that first-degree relatives are 5 times more likely to develop an illness such as OCD themselves if someone has OCD. So I want you to think about that. The other alternative one you could use is Billet, and you can choose whichever one you prefer. Conducted a meta-analysis of 14 twin studies, so that means there were 14 studies that he conducted, or that other people conducted, that Billet then mashed them all together and did a whole analysis of all 14. So he didn't conduct the research, but people he analysed other people's research to kind of develop one giant conclusion. And he found that identical twins were on average more than twice as likely to develop OCD if their twin had the disorder as well. So that's another very similar example. Same thing. Basic level, tell me what the findings are. Much higher level, which I want all of you to be aiming for A2, is why does that support or oppose the biological approach? And then your standard sandwich at the other side. What's your supporting sentence? This is a strength because sentence. Practical applications. I put little notes to remind myself of the diagram. Please do not panic if you're not sure of this one, because we're going to go over it very briefly, and in biopsychology we're going to do it in lots of detail. However, it is going to be a flipped learning in the future. The more you get it now, the quicker your flipped learning will be, the closer to the exams. So the more you understand it, the better. A strength of the biological approach is it has some excellent practical applications. For example, SSRIs, which are a type of drug called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which sounds very, very fancy, but it's really, really simple. You should all be familiar with the concept of synaptic transmission. So the neurotransmitter is released into the synapse and binds with the receptor. Then it activates or doesn't activate, depending on, makes it the postsynaptic neuron more or less likely to fire, depending on whether it's excitatory or inhibitory. It's released back into the synaptic gap and then is reabsorbed in a process called reuptake. Now we put the reuptake channels just here, however here they've just got them here, so don't worry too much about that. What they have done is that these are the SSRIs, and they block the serotonin reuptake. They block the reuptake channels, which means all the serotonin stays in the synaptic gap and binds more to the receptors. And that means that there's more serotonin available to bind to the receptors and have the desired effect on the neurotransmitters. Okay, so please do have a think about that. I'm going to do a tiny bit of Google. Might be a bit terrifying because, let me just check if I've got any more. No. Google might be a bit terrifying because it's in so much, it'll be very, very complex. Some of it will be very, very complex levels. Ideal for you if you're doing biology or if you want to go into something vaguely medical. If you don't, just do a little bit of reading. Tutor2You might be a good one. Look at a couple of really simple diagrams for SSRIs and how they work, so you're prepared for psychopathology. And then evaluation of the method. So remember the wording really carefully. I want you to write that sentence out in full, word it very, very carefully. How do you evaluate the problem that I am going to explain? How do you structure it? So obviously biological approach relies a lot on twin studies, and there are problems with twin studies. The key problem that we would have is we assume that the amount of environment, the amount of nurture that MZ twins share and the amount that DZ twins share is the same. As in, we assume that the way people treat two DZ twins in a house is the same as the way people would treat two MZ twins, which isn't necessarily the case, because of course MZ twins look identical, DZ twins do not. So there is the potential for MZ twins to be treated more alike than DZ twins, therefore suggesting that actually there's a difference in the level of nurture. We've not controlled for nurture because some twins will be treated more alike than others, which could affect the likelihood of them developing the illness, affecting the concordance rates. I'm going to put a link in the biological approach to an amazing website called Psychology Wizard. I've mentioned it before. This is based on the EdXL specification, with some information about twin studies, particularly if you're going into A2, particularly if you're wanting to get good grades, particularly if you're thinking of going on to psychology afterwards. I'd recommend that you read it. The more information, the more links you can make, the better. Just a brief read and make some notes. But that is the basics that you need to know. Why is it a problem that the biological approach relies on research that is based on twin studies? What is the impact? And then the final one, so that evaluation of methods is a weakness. The next one is again a weakness, so the contrast to alternatives. So a weakness of the biological approach is that it doesn't take into account environmental factors. And then so it's only on the nature side of the nature-nurture debate. And then there are 3 different examples that you can use, and you can choose any of them. You can talk about the behaviourist approach and social learning theory, and you're flipping the evaluation point on its head. So for the previous ones, you said it's a problem that when you've considered aggression, they've not considered testosterone. This time, the biological approach would consider testosterone. What it would not consider is environmental factors, such as reinforcement for violent behaviours, or the ability to observe a role model. Couldn't explain those. It can't explain why someone with 2 people with the same level of testosterone might behave differently in a way the behaviourist approach can. There is also a piece of research, particularly if you did GCSE, and this is the only time you could use your GCSE psychology specifically. You can use all the skills from it, where we look at Mednick, and Mednick found that there was a difference that looked at adopted children, or children that were raised in their biological families, and their effect on criminal behaviour. And he found it was a mixture of environment and biology. Let me just find, and I will find I'll include the findings of Mednick. So Mednick looked at children with who were adopted, and compared crime rates. So he found that if you had you had parents who had committed crimes, who were if you had biological parents who committed crimes, and you had adoptive parents who were criminal, so that's both the influence of nature and nurture, then you were 24.5% more likely to commit crime. The next highest percentage is if you had convicted biological parents, so biological parents who were criminals, but non-convicted adoptive parents. That is parents, so you would get the gene for criminal behaviour, but you would not get the environment for criminal behaviour. And yet they were still the second highest. So clearly this shows that nature versus nurture, both together, make you more vulnerable to criminal behaviour. However, of the 2, the most significant factor is biological parents. not nurture. So Mednick supports that. That's an alternative one that you could use that I think is quite an interesting one. We don't want to look at SSRIs, we've already looked at those. The other one you could look at is the diathesis stress model, and this looks at lots of different things, but the one example that I would use is for schizophrenia. So this is sometimes called the drip effect as well, but I'd stick with the term diathesis stress model. This is, imagine, and the analogy they use is a bucket. So I want you to imagine, and when the bucket overflows, that person develops schizophrenia. So imagine there's a person who has a genetic propensity, it has a genetic mutation which makes them more likely to, which is just another word for propensity, a leaning towards, makes them more likely to develop schizophrenia. The diathesis stress model suggests on its own that is not enough, because your bucket would only be half full of genetic factors. Then lots of environmental stresses are added. So if you have a genetic propensity and you have lots of environmental stresses added, then your bucket will overflow and you will develop schizophrenia. If you're a person with no genetic propensity and yet you have enough environmental stresses, your bucket can still fill up and overflow and you can develop schizophrenia. The third point is you could have a genetic propensity towards schizophrenia, so your bucket is half full, but you have an environment that has no stressors, no stressor stimuluses in it, and therefore you wouldn't develop schizophrenia. So diathesis stress model acknowledges that it's an interaction between environment and genetics. So nature versus nurture. Biological approach only considers nature. The different examples you could use the behaviourist approach or social learning theory to illustrate that the biological approach doesn't take into account environmental factors. You could use Mednick to show that whilst biological factors is important, you are most vulnerable to criminal behaviour when it's an interaction between nature and nurture, and the same with the diathesis stress model. The diathesis stress model says the best way to predict human behaviour is an interaction between nature and nurture. And the interactionist approach is absolutely vital for the approaches at A02. So remember the term interactionist, working between nature and nurture, working together. And that is that. So thank you very much. Well done for listening to the second half of the video for biological approach.